So I'm Valerie Robinson, and over on the side screen, you should see Lucinda Flowers. There she is. So we are sort of your facilitators for today, and we are going to be assisting you in getting some of your questions answered, and also introducing our speaker, Jade Russell, today. So Lucinda is an experienced affordable housing policy advocacy and communications professional, and she started her own consulting practice 4 years ago. She's worked in housing policy and advocacy for several years. And this is Lucinda on the screen. You're mute. You need to unmute. She's still muted.
How's that?
That's good.
Okay, sorry. I had a little audio problem for a second. So did everybody, Valerie, did you introduce yourself, or you need me to introduce you?
I didn't really introduce myself, but we can just move on.
Okay, sorry.
He introduced.
For those of you, good morning, everybody. And Valerie and I are helping FNO, to be able to do that, FNO moderate this webinar series. And Valerie has had her own firm, Marketing and Public Relations, for more than 20 years. And she's also a community leader and has worked in the affordable housing and community development space for years. So this is work that I think that is close to both of our hearts. So we're pleased to be here today. And with that, without further ado, as they say, we're going to bring in Jade Russell, who is our presenter for today, who is really going to get into some nuts and bolts, really, of the pilot program that FNO is starting. And at the end, we ask participants to type in questions, and we will
chat box, please.
Yeah, we will get. Yeah, I'm sorry. We will get to you at the end of the presentation. And just a reminder to people who are just signing in, look in the chat box. There is a link there there's a link for you to sign in as a participant. So if you didn't use that link, please hang up and use the link that is in the chat, okay? And so without further ado, I think I'm gonna turn it over to Jade, who is, I think is the General Counsel for Finance New Orleans. She's also the General Counsel for Harrah's of New Orleans. She's a native, a graduate of Howard and Southern University Law, and she is an expert in development and also in using equity. So in figuring out the whole equity equation, I would say. So without further ado, here's Jade.
Thank you, Lucinda. Thank you, Valerie, for the introduction. I also want to thank the Finance New Orleans team for pulling together these webinars and the series of webinars to really focus in on the number one, the great work that they're doing, but also the work that is so necessary as it relates to affordable housing in the city of New Orleans. So just as a administrative kind of matter, I'm going to ask if everyone or whoever is facilitating the back end of the session to place everyone on mute so we don't have of course, if you need to come off of mute, you can unmute yourself. With that said, I'll go ahead and get started. So today, the topic that I will be focusing on for this webinar is an overview of the pilot program that FNO recently launched in collaboration with the City of New Orleans, as well as the Louisiana Housing Corporation. Before I get into the program, of course, for those of you who are new to FANO, those of you who are unfamiliar with the work, I think many of you are familiar with the work, but for those of you who are not, here is just a little bit about what FANO is and what its mission is and what it focuses on. FANO is a public trust created by law. It's a public corporation, but the work that it does benefits the city of New Orleans, right? So that's a really, really important issue that you have to keep in mind as we're talking about pilots, as well as other financing tools that we'll get into just a little bit further into the presentation. FANO's mission is to improve the quality of life in the city of New Orleans by directly investing in the creation of affordable housing and economic development projects that produce quality jobs and wealth for our residents. And they do that by providing mortgage financing to low to moderate income families and credit support for affordable rental and community development projects. So that last piece is really what we're going to focus in on today, affordable rental and community development projects. Pilots generally, if you're not familiar with pilots, it is an acronym for payment in lieu of tax. It is a payment that you remit to either a taxing authority or in this case, FANO, which again operates for the benefit of the city of New Orleans. FANO is authorized to issue pilots by law. The law requires FANO to collaborate very closely with the city of New Orleans because what we're talking about is actual tax dollars, right? These are payments that are made in lieu of or in replacement of property taxes that a developer would pay on a development. Recently, last year on December 19th, the City Council adopted an ordinance which permitted FANO to issue pilots and to continue to incentivize developments in areas most in need of it, while also leveraging the economic activity in the city to create a significant amount of new affordable housing opportunities for citizens. And so that's what we're gonna spend some time today talking about what that process looks like and how you as a developer can get connected to this very, very new but rewarding program that FANO has. So just in general, pilots can come with challenges. And part of the work that FANO has been doing has been around ensuring that the challenges that come with pilots generally are alleviated or mitigated as much as possible. So what I want to do is just go really quickly through these challenges, and I think you'll get a better idea and understanding of what FANO has done and how they've done the work to mitigate the challenges that oftentimes can come with pilot structures. So the first is forecasting, right? So the pilot arrangements that are negotiated often, you don't have a looking glass. You can't see 10, 15, 40 years down the road. And what you'll see later is one of the features of FANO's pilot program is that the pilot arrangements can last up to 40 years. So the difficulty becomes, well, what will the world look like in 40 years? What will this development look like in 40 years? What will its worth or its tax assessment look like in 40 years? And that's a difficult thing to do. But what you have to do is you have to really weigh the cost and the benefits of these types of programs. So that is something that is built into the FANO program to protect and shield us away from forecasting that may not be in the best interest of the city and of the taxpayers. So we have worked very carefully to ensure that we're forecasting in a responsible way. The second challenge, and both the second and the third challenge really focus in on other metrics that are determined, and they use property values as a baseline. So the tax cap formula, this is just generally speaking, also dictates how a city is able to either raise its tax levy in any given year. And they use property taxes to make that determination. So if you think about the pilot structures, those pilots are not taken into account when the tax cap is being formulated. And so the pilots could arguably cause the cap to be slightly lower. And so we have to be careful of that. And lastly, sales tax formula. Sales tax, the amount of sales tax that is distributed in each city is also partly based on property tax values. Again, and when they're calculating that, pilots are often not a part of that calculation. And so we, again, I just wanted to highlight some of the challenges generally that come with pilot programs. Now, just like there are challenges, there are immense benefits to pilot programs. The first is the commerce effect. So if you really think back to post-Katrina, immediately following post-Katrina, there were a number of projects that took advantage and benefited from the pilot programs that other agencies were offering. Because the benefit is that they're putting properties, they're putting developments, they're putting buildings and land back into commerce, things that have fallen, in this particular case that I'm talking about with Katrina wiped so many things out, and really developers were incentivized to bring New Orleans back through programs like the pilot programs that the city was offering. Also, pilot arrangements and programs also are a huge job creator, because the pilots close gaps for developers and make developments more achievable and accessible. They're creating new jobs, right? They're also supporting other small businesses during the development, such as DBEs. So those are the two, benefits. Again, there are a ton of other benefits that come in terms of construction jobs, that in terms of permanent jobs once the project is completed. So there are a host of other benefits, but I just wanted to give you an equal balance of the pros and the cons. All right, so just generally speaking, again, pilots are incentives to develop. And I like to say that pilots are just one tool in a toolbox. Developers have a number of tools accessible to them, including bonds, taxable, both taxable and tax exempt. They have tax credits. You have low income housing tax credits, which I know is a subsequent webinar series that will be coming. You also have historical tax credits that developers tack onto depending on the status of the property that they are developing. Post-Katrina, the program is no longer running, but I thought it was important to highlight it here. Post-Katrina, there were GO Zone bonds that were highly tapped following Hurricane Katrina, and many of the projects that you see downtown benefited from GO Zone bonds as well as pilot programs. Okay, so again, just to recap, we're talking about job creation. We're talking about economic benefits by generating savings during the construction and the ramp up of a project or expansion. Again, one tool in the toolbox that we're talking about. Okay, so this is just a little bit more about the pilots and how they are incentives to developers. Developers really are seeking property tax relief from the city. In a nutshell, that's what the pilot program offers. And what happens is it offsets the loss in rental income created by offering below market leases to families in need. It is very important to understand that FNO's focus in this regard as it relates to pilots is that they want to create more affordable housing. According to Housing NOLA, last year, and I'm sure the circumstances, the numbers have increased since then, but we had approximately roughly 34,000 affordable housing units that we needed to create in the city of New Orleans. Again, that is from a year ago, and I'm sure that number has increased, particularly at, on the back end of the COVID crisis that we're seeing. And so the focus of this program is to ensure that as developers develop projects in the city of New Orleans, that they really do make an intentional and deliberate effort to create more affordable housing. The process for acquiring a property tax exemption from FNO is designed to be fair. It is designed to be transparent, and we're going to get into what the process looks like. And it's also based on predictable market factors. The goal is to stimulate, again, affordable housing while generating a reasonable market-based financial benefit for the taxpayers. So this is just a graphic of generally how pilots work. They can be much more complicated than this, but for those of you who are not familiar with how pilots work and how these properties really get off of the tax rolls and get the tax relief that comes attached to the pilots, the first thing is a developer is going to transfer title of their property to FNO. And for those of you who are familiar, that may not sound like that's something that you would want to do, but of course, the devil is in the fine print. The details are in the fine print, right? So here, what we're talking about is a transfer in title, but then that property is then leased back to the developer. So the property is transferred from the developer to FNO, and that is subject to certain underwriting criteria and approvals. Okay. Now, just because the property transfers title, that does not then place all of the risk on FNO. The property is still going to be maintained. Insurance still needs to be maintained. All of the other risk issues related to the property will need to be maintained. And again, all of that information will be in the deal documents to ensure that those types of risks still lay on the developer. But once that title is transferred, the property then comes off of the tax rolls, right? Because FNO is a nonprofit, right? It's a public trust, I should say. It's a public trust, and public trust property, the property belonging to a public trust, is not taxed. And so once it goes into the name of FNO, it comes off of the city's tax rolls. Then what happens is we then develop a lease agreement that leases the property from FNO back to the developer. So there is a lease agreement, and there's also the pilot agreement, which lays out the terms of the pilot that is negotiated by the parties. Once that happens, of course, the lease agreement sets out not only the terms of the lease that we just talked about, all of the risk factors and all of those things will be built into the lease, but it also includes the pilot payment, which provides for the structure of the pilot arrangement. And that includes the pilot as well as the annual administrative fee.
If I could just break in for 1 second, just to remind folks, if you're just dialing in, there is a link under the chat. If you look under chat, there is a link there that is a better link for you to sign in with. So if you could just, if you want to hang up and just rejoin us on that link. Thank you. Sorry, Jade. Thanks.
That's okay. So once the transactional documents, the lease agreement, the pilot agreement are prepared, FNO will receive the pilot payments from the developer or the applicant in this scenario, they'll receive those payments annually. FNO then will remit the pilot payment to the city minus its administration fee. And that is something that is going to be set in place. The pilot payment will be something that will be consistent for 10 years. I think that number may have shifted slightly. I think now it's 15 years that there will be a reassessment period. So it'll be reassessed every 15 years until the pilot expires. If you recall, we talked about pilots lasting for up to 40 years. So that pilot term can last anywhere from 10 to 15 to 40 years, depending on the specific project. And then once the pilot has expired, or if it is a project that includes bond financing, when the bonds have expired, that project then returns to the owner at the expiration of the pilot arrangement. Now, the thing that the staff has asked me to focus most on is the actual details of FNO's pilot program. So want to take a deeper dive right now into the FNO program. We've already talked about the fact that the maximum pilot term is up to 40 years. That means that you will have the pilot payment structure in place. The 40 years is typically going to be a project that has bond financing. So if the bonds are, if it's a 40-year bond deal, then your pilot will run side by side with the bond deal. Also, area median income requirements. To qualify for a FNO pilot, projects must reserve at least 10% of its units for families earning below 60% AMI. And the initial pilot payment for years 1 through 15 of an agreement are equal to no more than 150% of the current year's tax assessment at the time of closing. And I'm going to show you on the next slide what that looks like if we plug numbers into that process. Pilot payments are adjusted annually for inflation, and then they're reassessed every 15 years. All right, so let's just look at this example. Let's assume that this project has a current land value of $1 million and a current tax assessment of $8,000 annually, right? So keep thinking about that $8,000 annually that the project that is valued at $1 million would pay, right? Assume that the project has an as completed value of $10 million. So let's just say we have a piece of property that either the building is in horrible shape or there's no building at all there, right? And once it's built, it may take 2-3 years to build and complete the development. Once it's completed, the value of that property is going to increase. So the tax assessment, arguably, of that property would also increase. So let's assume that the project has an as completed value of $10 million and the developer's taxes would have approximately increased to $80,000. If you applied a pilot arrangement to this scenario, the pilot payment amount could potentially be up to $12,000. Now, how do we get to that $12,000? If you recall on this slide, the last section, we said that we could have pilot payments that are equal to no more than 150% of the current year's tax assessment. So that's how we get to the 12,000 here, 150% of the current year's tax assessment of $8,000. So arguably this project could be paying $12,000 annually. Of course, you tack on inflation, the annual inflation, but arguably they could be paying the $12,000, roughly a little bit more for the life of the pilot. over the 15 years, assuming a 3% annual increase in assessed value and a constant millage rate, the developer would remit slightly more than $148,000 in pilots and save over $1 million in tax payments. So this is why pilot programs and pilot arrangements are so attractive to developers, right? Because it saves you a lot of money. We're talking about a smaller project here in this example that over the life of the pilot, it'll save the developer over $1 million in tax payments. So if you start plugging in some higher numbers into this scenario, that savings will grow even more. And again, this is reassessed every 15 years for pilots that are longer. So it doesn't mean that you'll continue to pay that 12. If you have a 40-year pilot, that doesn't mean that you'll pay that 12,000 plus inflation every year for 40 years. At year 15, everything is going to be reassessed. And so that number may jump up in year 15 to a higher number just based on the current value of the property. So it really is, these pilots are really a give and take, right? The city is giving up, some of its potential tax revenues, but it is also creating, again, I'm sorry, I think I got muted for a second. But it shows that when you put properties back into commerce, there are so many benefits that make up for that quote unquote lost tax revenue that we miss out on with the pilot structure. All right, so let's just talk about what the process looks like. And I want you to think about the process in two regards. So one is a process that has inclusionary zone and affordable housing attached to it, but it doesn't have tax credit and it doesn't have bond financing. So just this is just inclusionary and affordable housing projects, right? This is the process. Step one is there's an initial eligibility and pre-submittal conference. What does that mean? That means that if you have your concept, you have your project prepared and you're ready to move forward with the application process, FNO's team will sit with you. They'll take a look at your project. They'll take a look at all of the backup documentation that you have prepared for your project, and they will actually prepare you and help you get through an application. Some of these applications can, require a great deal of information and backup. And oftentimes you have developers who are attracted to these types of products, but don't really know how to navigate through them. And so FNO's team is really working hard with developers to get them to the point where they can submit an application. So that is step one. Step two, you gather all of that information, all of the feedback that the FNO team has given you. You're ready now to submit your application. Once you submit your application, step three is for the FNO staff to review your application as submitted, and then it gets submitted to an underwriting committee. And this is a really important part because that underwriting committee consists of not just the FNO staff, but it also includes team members from the city's community development office, and also experts who have backgrounds in developments and finance and bonds. So it is a really, really experienced group of people who are looking at your application and determining whether it is worthy to move it forward to the board for consideration. Okay. Following that, FNO will conduct a public hearing. Now, why do they conduct a public hearing? They conduct a public hearing because we're talking about public tax dollars, right? And so you want to ensure that the public has an opportunity to weigh in on the project. I had a question from someone a couple weeks ago to say, well, what exactly are we looking to get out of the public hearing? What we're trying to see is, are there issues in terms of whether the community has any opposition to a project being placed in their neighborhoods? Those types of things are important for the public to have the opportunity to weigh in. And it's also important for the organizations, committees, and boards who have to make decisions in terms of approvals. It is also important for them to have that information as well. So there's a public hearing, and then following the public hearing, if all goes well, there are deal documents that are prepared. And we talked about what those deal documents look like, right? So it is the documents that pass title of the property from the developer to FNO. It is the lease agreement whereby FNO then leases the property or the development back to the developer. And it is also the pilot agreement where the actual structure of the pilot is detailed. So those documents, plus a couple of other ancillary documents, comprise of the deal documents that you see in step 4. And then in step 5, that is when the deal gets presented to the board for final approval. And then we have closing. Now, it's important when you look at this process to understand that this is a very expedited process in comparison to the process that you're going to see in the next couple slides. If you recall, I told you that this is the process for the projects that are mandatory inclusionary zone projects, mid-zone projects only, and have affordable housing components. And negotiating the pilot program in collaboration with the city, one thing that the city emphasized was that they wanted a more expedited process for these types of projects because these are the projects that we know for certain are creating those 30, will get us on the road to creating those 34,000 affordable housing units that we so desperately need in the city of New Orleans. So this is a more expedited process. Again, this is the process for inclusionary zone projects only. No bonds, no tax credits attached to this process. Now, we'll move on to talk about the process, which is a little bit more lengthy for projects that include bonds and tax credits. So here, some of these steps are very familiar because they're the same as those on the prior slide, right? So here you see that step 1, we have the eligibility and pre-submittal conference. Again, that is the same as the other process. Developers have the opportunity to meet with the FNO staff, really talk through their project and get them ready and ramped up for submitting the application. Right. So then once you've gone through that and you've gotten all of your paperwork in order, you submit your application on FNO's system. Again, same as the prior process, FNO will then, the FNO staff will review the project, review the application, and then submit that application to the underwriting committee. The underwriting committee, same committee, comprised of FNO staff and city staff as well as some experts in housing and finance and bonds. Again, that same team will review and underwrite your application to determine whether it's worthy to move it forward. Now, here's where the process differs for projects that include bond financing. And that bond financing, I should say, can be bond financing through FNO, or it could be through another agency that FNO collaborates with. So for example, in the past couple months, the City of New Orleans, Louisiana Housing Corporation, and FNO entered into a CEA where the Louisiana Housing Corporation will also be available to provide tax credit and bond financing on some projects, right? So they have their own underwriting process that will have to make sure projects are complying with. So if we look at step four is where things shift a bit, right? In comparison to the prior process. In step four, it is going to be moved to the programs committee at FNO and the board, but it is going to be for preliminary approval, not final approval. And once that preliminary approval is received, the underwriting process that I just talked about, the underwriting process for the Louisiana Housing Corporation will be completed as well if we're talking about bonds that are with the Louisiana Housing Corporation. And then the LHC, Louisiana Housing Corporation, and the State Bond Commission have to complete their preliminary approvals. Again, different process because of the insertion of bond financing and tax credits or tax credits, I should say. Once that preliminary approval is received from LHC and the State Bond Commission, there's well, in this case, this is the first public hearing. You have a public hearing, and then the documents begin getting prepared just like in the other scenario. FNO then has an opportunity after the FNO board then has the opportunity to get the feedback from the public hearing. We already talked about the importance of that public hearing, same thing here. And then the FNO board provides its final approval. If you recall, we already had the preliminary approval in step 6 from LHC and the State Bond Commission. And now once the FNO board gives its final approval, LHC and the State Bond Commission will also provide their final approval. And then there's closings and the bonds are delivered on the project. So again, it's a significantly more lengthy process just because there are multiple layers of approval that are required. And there are multiple agencies that have to make approvals. So in this particular scenario, you have to have approvals from FNO, from LHC, if they are issuing any of the bonds or the tax credits, as well as the State Bond Commission. So it's a lot more of a process than it is for those projects that do not have or are not seeking bond financing or tax credit financing. And then lastly, this is just kind of a graphic of the full process. And it includes many of the steps, but I feel like sometimes when you see it as a graphic, it's more, it's easier to digest. But again, a developer submits their application to FNO. They may, if they're seeking bond financing or tax credit financing from LHC, you'll have to submit your application to them as well. I know that FNO and LHC are working on more of a universal application so that there is not just a duplication of efforts in terms of submitting applications to both. I think that process is in the works. So you should stay tuned for that. FNO staff then reviews the projects and makes recommendations, and that is both the FNO staff and the underwriting committee. Then it is presented to the city and to the board for preliminary approval. And when we say submitted to the city doesn't necessarily have to actually approve it as in terms of it going to the city council. But again, FNO is working very closely in collaboration with the city on these projects, mainly because, again, these are tax dollars and we want to make sure that FNO is being prudent with those tax dollars. We didn't talk about really the cost benefit analysis, but there are situations where there may be a need for cost benefit analysis to be conducted by FNO or an independent third party that FNO engages and LHC in order to underwrite and properly determine whether the pilot structure in this case is worth foregoing the taxes that the property otherwise would be generating. Next, you'll see again the State Bond Commission and LHC for their preliminary approval, the public hearing, and the generation of the term sheets and deal documents. You see here again the final approval of FNO's board, and then the closing and the bonds are delivered. So I think that is just this is a good depiction of what the process looks like generally. Again, the process is different. The process is the same, but the timelines are different for each project because every project is different. Every project has different needs, and every developer comes with different. There are different issues and concerns with each one of those projects. But again, if we go back to what we talked about before, we have developed a consistent program, a transparent program, and to the extent that you have any questions at all, FNO staff is on standby to answer those questions. And if you have any questions about today's presentation, I am here. Now is a time, I think, where we can address any questions or concerns. So I will hand it back over to Lucinda and Valerie and answer any questions that may be out there.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Jade, and giving a real deep dive into the pilot program. I'm certain everybody has learned some things they didn't know, and if that's a program that's interesting to them or that might fit their project, definitely get in touch with somebody at FNO, or you can email us at rsvp.fano@gmail.com, and we can send your question to the right person. So either way you want to do it is fine. We don't have any questions in our chat box right now. Is anybody they'd like to submit?
And if Valerie, if I could just come in, sorry, I was muted before. Apologies for that. I think we want to reiterate that we know this is a lot of information for folks, and we do want people to feel, people who are large and more experienced firms and maybe smaller and less experienced firms, to all feel that they can access this information. And so the real purpose here is to try to demystify it. But again, we know it's a lot. So we want to encourage you. First of all, this presentation will be available on FNO's YouTube channel. But we want to encourage folks, even after we get off the webinar here, if you have questions, please step up. We want to work with, with folks at all levels of experience and size. So please remember that and be sure to reach out if you have any questions. And on that note, I think we're going to say first, thank you again, Jade. The next workshop.
We have a couple of questions.
Oh, we do? Okay. All right, let's see. Okay.
So we have a question who says, how long does the process take from application submittal to closing?
That's an excellent question. So again, it's going to vary depending on the individual project. However, if it is a project, if it's what I call a MIS only project, so it doesn't have any bonds or tax credits attached to it, and you're just requesting a pilot, that process, just generally speaking, can take anywhere between 60 to 90 days. But again, it could be longer than that, depending on the underwriting process, right? So if there are some issues that come up during the underwriting process and FNO has requested more information from you, and then the delay time with all of that could kick that timeline out a little bit further. But if you just assume that everything is perfect, everything is perfectly submitted, all of the documentation is in order, all of the boxes are checked, that process can take anywhere from 60 to 90 days. Again, that is without, that's an application that doesn't include bond financing or tax credits, right? The application that includes bond financing or tax credits can take anywhere from 6 to 9 months. And the reason is because of what we talked about, which is that layered and multiple agency approvals, right? So you've got to think about it. You have to wait, once you get a preliminary approval, you've got to wait another month, arguably, until you get on an agenda for LHC. Or you have to wait another month before you get on the agenda for the Louisiana State Bond Commission. So that timeline can take a lot longer. Again, 6 to 9 months is probably the average, but same scenario, if during the underwriting process, additional information is needed, or if a cost benefit analysis is required, that can vary the length of that timeline. But arguably 6 to 9 months is a safe timeline.
We have
another question. What other agencies approve pilots? We have a few more coming in too.
To my knowledge, in the city of New Orleans, the Industrial Development Board of New Orleans also issues pilots. I think that is the only agency that I'm aware of that issues pilots. There may be others that I'm unaware of.
Okay, the next question, who determines whether the developer has 5 or 40 years? Can developers have multiple pilot projects going at the same time?
I'm sorry, Lucinda, you cut off a little bit. Can you repeat that?
Sure. It's who determines whether the developer has 5 or 40 years? Can you hear me? Am I good? Mm-hmm. Can developers have multiple pilot projects ongoing at the same time?
So the first question in terms of who determines the length of the pilot, so that'll be something that will be determined. Of course, the developer can definitely request a certain length of a pilot, but that determination is going to be made in the underwriting process. And so that is the sole determining factor of how lengthy a pilot is. Now, when we talk about a 40-year pilot, again, that is a pilot that is running side by side with the bond financing. So if the bond financing is 40 years, then you arguably could have a pilot structure that is running commensurate with that. So that I think that addresses the first question. The second question was whether a developer can have multiple pilot arrangements in place. And if we're talking about multiple developments, the answer is yes. But on any specific or any particular property or project, it is only going to have one pilot arrangement on it.
Okay. We have one more, it's kind of a question and a comment. It says, last I checked, city planning had not created the MIZ zones at this time. Is there an expectation on when this will be complete? What's the recommended pathway for pilot applicants?
Right. So excellent point, excellent question. The city is still working out the actual zone for the inclusionary zoning, but that does not stop a developer at this juncture from applying for a pilot. Right. So FNO, again, in collaboration with the city, has gotten the green light to move forward with reviewing applications submitted by developers and beginning the process of creating these pilot arrangements with developers, even in the absence of the inclusionary zone. Now, the project still needs to include affordable units, right? So that is still the focus, because ultimately that is the mission of FANO, is to create more affordable housing opportunities for New Orleanians. So the fact that we do not have the inclusionary zone maps yet, it has not been something that has precluded us from moving forward with this process. So great question.
Okay, any other questions? Looks like that's all of them.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you again, Jade. As Jade said, these panel, what we're trying to talk about here are some of the tools that developers can use. And our next workshop on September 18th, same time, is going to be involving low-income housing tax credits, which again is another tool for folks to use. So, Jade, do you have any final thoughts? Jade,
I'm sorry, I had to unmute myself. You know what? I just want to encourage everyone to take advantage of the webinars, number one, and get more information about the programs of Finance New Orleans. I will also just encourage developers to continue to push. I know navigating through these types of programs can be difficult sometimes, and definitely for smaller developers. But I think the program that FANO has put together, it has been with them in mind, to make a more streamlined process where it is fully transparent about what the process is. And there is a road to a more expedited process. I'm really just pleased with the fact that that was something that the city focused on heavily. Like, how can we move the needle quicker to create more affordable housing in a meaningful and transparent way, so everyone knows what the process is, they know what they're going to end up with, you know, should their project meet the criteria. And so I applaud the city for those efforts. But I just encourage everyone to look into these into these programs, because these are the things that make the difference between a project moving forward and a project not moving forward. So just encourage you all to tap into all of the resources.
Valerie, you have anything you want to close us down, please?
Yes, I do. We do have another webinar 18th, and then there's another one the following week. So it's really a part A and a part B, because it's about tax credits and incentives, and they kind of go together. So you might want to put those on your calendar. And we have that up on the screen now. We'll be sending more out about that. This afternoon, you will get the link to the YouTube video. And also, we're sending you a short survey. Shouldn't take more than a couple of minutes for you to finish it. And we just want to hear from you, and we want to see what we can do better. And if you have ideas about things that would be important to you, we want to know that too. So that is really all we have for today. If there are no more questions, I don't see any more questions. So if you want to contact Jade, that's her email address. And again, you can get additional information by sending us an email. If there is nothing else, then we again thank you for being here and hope that you'll continue to join us. Happy weekend.
Thank you.